Hello everyone and welcome back to Limited Review Week. I'm Nitzahon and I'm spending every day for the next week reviewing the cards of Amonkhet in terms of Limited. Yesterday I covered white and tomorrow I'll continue with black and so on. Before we get started with the cards, here's a quick rundown on how I grade them. If you've already seen this on another Amonkhet Limited Review video, feel free to skip ahead. There's a timestamp in the description below that will allow you to do this. I'm going to be using letter grades in this Limited Review. That is what the overwhelming majority of people voted for in a Twitter poll that I conducted. If you'd like to see a different method, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's go through each of these letter grades, and for each of them, I'll give some examples from Kaladesh block that I would have given these grades. So as you may have expected, A is the best grade that a card can get. Well, A+ is actually, but those are few and far between. A's are cards that are so powerful that they completely shift a game in your favor, almost regardless of the board state. They are also so strong that they pull you into their colors and tempt you to find a way to splash them. They are most frequently made up of rares and mythics, though the occasional uncommon does find its way in there. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block would be cards like Herald of Anguish and Verdurous Gearhulk. These are basically the cards that you most want to open and pick in your first pack because they give your deck such a massive power boost. Next up we have cards that receive a B. These are still great cards, but not quite as game-warping as A-level cards. This category is made up of cards that should basically always be making the cut in your deck if they're in your color. This includes premium removal and extremely efficient and powerful creatures. Cards at this grade level don't tempt you to change your entire draft the way A-level cards do, but they make the cut 100% of the time in your deck if you're in their colors. Most frequently, these are of uncommon rarity or higher, though sometimes commons get in the mix. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block are Thopter Arrest and Scrapper Champion. Next, there are C-level cards. While A's and B's are the kind of cards you're happy to first pick, C's aren't quite as exciting. They're the kind of card that basically always makes your deck if they're in your color, but aren't incredibly powerful. Here is where you find solid and efficient creatures as well as decent removal, and this is usually what the majority of your deck is actually made up of. Some examples of C-level cards from Kaladesh block are cards like Ether Swooper and Shock. Basically, these are all cards you feel good about having in your deck, but not great about taking super early. So in an ideal world, your deck will be made up entirely of cards in the A through C range. That's something to keep in mind in general as I go through cards in this list and in the other limited review videos. Cards in the D and F range are not cards you generally want in your deck. However, D cards aren't entirely terrible, but they're cards that frequently get cut from your deck and are basically just filler to help you with your curve. Generally, things have to go a little bit wrong during your draft for you to end up with more than a few D cards in your deck, as you are stretching to include every playable card you drafted if they're showing up there. Some examples of this are Ether Inspector and Reservoir Walker. Both of these cards are cards I ended up playing a few times in the format, but I was never very happy to have to do it. Generally, most decks are made up of B's and C's because A's are so rare and D's are mediocre playables that will sometimes make the cut. However, there is a grade even worse than D, obviously, and that is F. These are cards that I consider utterly unplayable and shouldn't end up in your deck for any reason. These are the cards that always seem to be the last cards you pick up in booster packs. Some recent examples of this would be Gonti's Machinations and Take Into Custody. A few more words on grading. There's some more nuance to it in many cases. I will give some cards a grade range instead of just a single letter grade because some cards are stone unplayable in some decks but become very good if your deck meets certain requirements. A good example of this from Ether Revolt is Efficient Construction. This card just gets a straight F if you have less than 5 artifacts, but if you get to 10 or more, it suddenly becomes a B. These type of nuances show up from time to time while grading cards, and I will draw your attention to them when we run into cards like it. There are also cards that aren't very good main board, but are pretty good out of the sideboard. For these cards, I will give grades based on how good I think the card would be in my main board, but also a sideboard grade that reflects how happy I am to have that card available out of my sideboard. A good example of this is Takedown, which is a D main board, but a B out of your sideboard. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's talk about and grade every single blue card in Amonkhet. First, we have up Ancient Crab, which is 1 colorless mana and 2 blue mana for a 1/5. It has to be one of the most anticipated reprints in a while, Ancient Crab, and it's just sort of a generic vanilla card. A 3 mana 1/5 is nothing special, but he isn't stone unplayable either. He's actually a pretty reasonable blocker for a control deck or a deck with lots of flyers. That said, he isn't going to end up in your deck most of the time because there are just better things to do with your mana. A deck with a bunch of flyers would rather have a 3-drop that has flying, and a control deck would rather have a creature that gives you a little more bang for your buck. But hey, if you don't get those things, Ancient Crab is a decent card to make it into your deck. The crab is also worth keeping in mind as a sideboard card, as he makes decks that have a lot of X1s and decks that are predominantly ground creature based look kind of silly. He still isn't something super exciting out of your sideboard though. I give him a D+ as a main board card and a C- as a sideboard card. He's just mediocre filler basically, and most of the time when you are drafting blue you aren't going to want to run him, so don't take him early. Just pick him up when you are near the end of the pack and happy to be in blue. Don't worry, he'll still be there. Angler Drake is our next card, and it's 4 colorless mana and 2 blue mana for a 4/4 with flying. With when Angler Drake enters the battlefield, you may return target creature to its owner's hand. This is my kind of Magic card. I love creatures that bounce other creatures, and I love them even more when they happen to be 4/4 flyers who can win the game in the air. 6 mana is only 1 more than I would be willing to pay for a 4/4 flyer anyway, so paying 1 more to mana war something is a pretty solid deal. Bouncing things always feels great when you are developing your board at the same time, and while it is difficult to come out ahead mana-wise with the Drake, since he costs 6 mana himself, the fact that you're developing your board with such a real threat is a problem for your opponent. I predict Angler Drake will be a card with mythic uncommon status that you will basically only get on your hands if you open it yourself, and he is a card that every single blue deck would take as many copies of as possible. Okay, probably not more than 4 since he costs 6 mana, but you get my point. Angler Drake gets a B+ from me in the end. It is a great card, but probably not quite on the level of a game-breaking bomb, but I really wanted to give it an A-. I'm just trying to reel myself in about this card because my own playstyle tends to like Mana Wars so much, but it is definitely a card that goes first pick with really only the most premium removal and the biggest bombs being taken over it. Next, we have As Foretold, which costs 2 colorless mana and 1 blue mana for an enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a time counter on As Foretold. Once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a spell you cast with converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of time counters on As Foretold. This card is generating a lot of buzz in Constructed, but that's because it can actually be effectively built around there, where decks are more consistent, and you can build them out of a much larger pool of cards and not a random pool of cards. In Limited, you would need a ton of good luck, in-game and in draft, to make this work, and in fact, no, you know what? Let's just give this an F, because more often than not, if you draft this and try to build around it, you're going to end up with a pile of garbage. Usually you will pay 3 mana on an enchantment that will do next to nothing, and paying 3 mana to not really affect the board is a dangerous play while your opponent curves out. You would have to keep your hand pretty well stocked to consistently be able to get value out of this card, and you would need the right cards to be able to cast something free every turn, and that's just not going to happen in Limited, so you will have wasted your mana pretty badly. Also, imagine top decking this thing late. It really isn't good at any stage of the game, but it is terrible at every stage of the game. So yes, F it is. The only reason to draft this card is if it pans out in Standard or Modern, and is worth picking up based on its monetary value. Next, we have Aven Initiate, who for 3 colorless and 1 blue mana is a 3/2 flyer, and it has Embalm. This is the first time we've seen Embalm in this particular video, so I'll remind you what it does. It lets you exile a creature card from your graveyard and pay a mana cost to create a token copy of that card that is also a zombie and white in addition to its other creature types. Actually, it's just white, so not in addition to color, but just in addition to creature types. For example, this becomes a zombie bird warrior, which is quite a mouthful. Aven Initiate is a 4 mana 3/2 flyer, and 4 mana 3/2 flyers are usually playable and limited, and a vanilla one probably usually gets around a C-, but Aven Initiate also comes with Embalm. A rather steep Embalm cost, but Embalm nonetheless, having the ability to bring an evasive creature out of your graveyard when you get to the late game and are flooding out is pretty nice. Aven Initiate is the kind of card any blue deck will play, but no one will be overly excited about, so I think that means it's about a C. Next, we have Cancel. It's a reprint. We've seen it before. 1 colorless, double blue, instant counter target spell. I'm not the hugest fan of counter spells, mostly because they make you look really bad when your opponent plays around them. And because you have to leave up mana for them, you have an opportunity cost of not building up your board. That said, Cancel is a hard counter and is at least going to do something at all stages of the game thanks to that. Just a little PSA though, don't think of counter spells as equivalent to removal. They are way worse than that. With removal, you don't have to keep the mana up to kill the creature when it's played. You can untap it and do it on your turn. With counter magic, you have to have the mana up at the right time, and that makes it significantly worse. Still, this is a playable counter spell, not a card I will usually want more than one of in my main board, and not one I'll be sad if I don't get one of, and that means it's about a C-. Next, we have Cartouche of Knowledge. For 1 colorless and blue, you get an enchantment, Aura Cartouche, that has enchant creature you control. When Cartouche of Knowledge enters the battlefield, draw a card. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying. Cartouche of Knowledge is another aura that replaces itself, just like the white Cartouche does, this one by drawing you a card, And as I mentioned in the discussion of the white cartouche, I'm usually down for auras that do that since they help you avoid getting 2-for-1, a risk that most auras carry. What's more is it grants flying and +1/+1 to whatever you put it on, and flying is a powerful effect for an aura, as it can sometimes turn your ground creature into a legit win condition. On top of that, the cartouche of course synergizes with the trials, as all of the cards in the trial cycle go back to your hand when you play a cartouche. All in all, this is the kind of card that any blue deck with a decent number of creatures wants to play, and like all the cartouches, this gets better the more trials you have, pushing itself closer to a C+ and B- range when you pick up a couple of them, but generally, I'm going to give this card a C. I would be happy taking this cartouche somewhere in the middle of the pack. Next, we have Censor, which for 1 colorless and a blue says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1, and it has a cycling of 1 blue mana. Cycling, since we haven't seen it yet, I'll remind you, it means you can pay a cost and discard the card to draw a card. I'm not normally a huge fan of counterspells, as I've already noted. Having to leave mana up and having to have your opponent play into them, etc. is all pretty bad. That said, I do think Censor is actually playable. Why? Well, because once I get into 2-mana counterspells, I feel like the downside of leaving mana up isn't too bad. Yes, the opponent can pay 1 to keep from getting the card counter, but this is actually a pretty solid card early game because your opponent will be trying to curve out, and if you counter their 3 or 4 drop with this, that doesn't feel too terrible. In the late game, it gets to be terrible, and if this card didn't have cycling, it would be an F or maybe a D because it's so horrendous in late game situations. However, adding cycling to a card like this makes it far better. In the late game, when your opponent is sitting on 13 mana and you top deck this, you don't have to groan so much. You can just pitch it and draw another card, and that's a pretty big deal, especially for 1 blue mana. What's more is there are several payoffs for cycling in this format, and those make this card even more playable. All in all, I'm willing to give this card a C-. In your opening hand, you'll almost always get to counter something decent, and at most other stages of the game, it is basically just a cantrip. But if we look at this as a split card that has Censor on one side and blue draw a card on the other side, I would play that card. That said, you probably don't want more than 1 in your deck unless you really get there on cycling payoffs, and it shouldn't be hard for most people drafting blue to pick up a single copy of this card, so don't take it too early, but be happy to pick one up in the latter part of the pack. Next, we look at Commit to Memory, which is a split card with the Aftermath mechanic. The first half of the card is an instant for 3 colorless and a blue, and it says, put target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library second from the top. The memory half is a sorcery, and it has Aftermath, which means it can be cast from your graveyard. So this is 2 cards. You get to cast one of them from your hand and the other one from your graveyard. The memory half says each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, then draws 7 cards. Just the commit half of this card is pretty solid. It has a flexibility to put a spell on the stack in your opponent's library too from the top, or a permanent. Both are pretty nice, and that half alone I think would be about a B-. The memory half of the card is a little more symmetrical, but it still gives you some good late game value, especially if your opponent's hand has more cards in it than you do, and you find yourself in top deck mode. It's going to be pretty good to use memory so that you can get on the same level as your opponent in terms of cards. Overall, I think this card is a B. Between the powerful commit side and the late game value of memory, I don't hate taking this card early on in a draft. Next, we have Compelling Argument, which is 1 colorless mana and 1 blue mana for a sorcery that says target player puts the top 5 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, and it has cycling for 1 blue mana. Milling is not going to be a real win condition in the format, so the optimal thing to do with this is target yourself if you have a deck with Aftermath spells and embalmed creatures. That's not very good though, and if this card didn't have cycling, I would give it an F. However, there are enough payoffs in this format for cycling, especially in blue, that a cheap cycling cost of 1 blue mana actually makes this thing playable in the right deck, one that has a ton of cycling synergy, and because of that, I'll give it a D, but don't plan on taking this card early. Most decks aren't going to want it. Next, we have Cryptic Serpent, which is 5 colorless mana and 2 blue mana for a 6/5 Serpent that says Cryptic Serpent costs 1 less to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Cryptic Serpent has a lot in common with Gearseeker Serpent from Kaladesh. Same mana cost, creature type, and a reduced cost clause, but this is nowhere near as good as Gearseeker Serpent, unfortunately. Most decks in Limited only play a handful of instants and sorties, and while spells matter as the blue-red archetype in this format, getting enough into your graveyard to cast this guy early still isn't going to be super easy, as this format only has a few ways of throwing cards in the graveyard. We just looked at one of them, but it's a pretty unplayable card generally. I think the typical situation you can expect is to cast the Serpent on turn 5 or so, which isn't bad, but it also isn't the payoff your deck wants the most for a blue-red spells deck in the way that Gearseeker Serpent was the card you wanted in an artifact-heavy deck in Kaladesh. Since really only one deck wants this card, again, blue-red, I don't think it needs to be taken early. If you want it, it will come back to you. I give this card a C overall just because it won't ever be crazy efficient. Playing this on turn 4 or earlier seems near impossible. Next, we look at Curator of Mysteries, who is 2 colorless and 2 blue mana for a 4/4 flyer, and it says, whenever you cycle or discard another card, scry 1, and it has a cycling cost of its own of 1 blue mana. 4 mana for a 4/4 flyer is already a good card in Limited. Normally when we see that, it comes with some downside, but instead this comes with upside. Getting to scry every time you cycle a card is pretty real value. You can sort of think of scrying as drawing a half a card, as it gives you a degree of card selection. So in a way, it makes it so that every time you cycle, you're drawing 1.5 cards. That's pretty good. Getting card selection when you were trying to bash your opponent to death with your 4/4 Sphinx is where you want to be. The Sphinx also has the extra added bonus of having cycling itself, though with it, you probably only want to cycle if you are in desperation mode, since chances are it is going to be one of the best cards in your deck. This is a first pickable rare that is only outshined by the completely ridiculous rares in this set, and I give it a B+. Don't feel bad about first picking it. Next, we have Decision Paralysis, which is 3 colorless and a blue mana for an instant that says tap up to 2 target creatures. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. We've seen effects like this a lot lately, and most of them have been pretty underwhelming. And this continues that trend. Usually in Limited, you at least want to be trading 1 for 1. That is, taking away one of your opponent's cards every time you do something, whether this is through a removal spell or trading with an opponent's creature. Cards like Decision Paralysis don't do that, and because of that, it is hard for me to give this a grade anywhere higher than a low C. It does have a place, as it is a pretty great tempo play. Paying 4 to lock down your opponent's 2 best creatures feels pretty great, whether you're on the beatdown or on defense, though it is worth noting that this effect is usually more impactful for an aggro deck in most cases, since stopping 2 creatures from blocking is usually going to have a more significant effect on the outcome of the game than stopping 2 creatures from attacking. Using the opening to try to kill your opponent is just more proactive than just slowing your opponent down and hoping you find a way to get ahead on board in the meantime. All in all, this card gets a C- from me. I might play it in the occasional blue deck, especially in blue-red spells matter decks, but I would almost always rather run a card that is capable of trading 1 for 1 if I can help it. Next, we have Drakehaven, 2 colorless and a blue mana, and it's an enchantment, and it says whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1 generic mana. If you do, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. Drakehaven is obviously a build-around card, and as a result, I'm going to give it 2 different grades. The first of these grades is what this card gets in your average Limited deck in the format, and that is an F. This card is stone unplayable unless you have a critical mass of cards with cycling in your deck. What is that critical mass? Well, I think around 7 or 8, you can feel okay about putting this in your deck, where it probably falls into the C range. Once you get to 10 or more, it probably pushes itself all the way up to a B. I don't think it ever quite gets into the A range. This is because it is still going to sometimes be a do-nothing enchantment, or maybe make you 1 Drake across the course of a game. The card doesn't really become worth it until your 3rd or 4th Drake, but if you can consistently make this thing into an engine, it becomes a pretty good card and one of the key ways your cycling heavy deck can win the game. Next, we have another reprint, Essence Scatter, which is 1 colorless and 1 blue mana, and it's an instant that says counter target creature spell. Of course, this is another reprint, and this card often gets compared to Negate, which usually falls in the D range, but is a good sideboard card against people playing big, bomby spells. That comparison is somewhat fair, but I think Essence Scatter is better. Why? Well, because people usually play 15 or more creatures in a Limited deck, and the chances that you actually get to counter something with this are much higher than it is with Negate. What really punishes you with counterspells, as we've mentioned numerous times, is having to leave mana up instead of developing your board. But for me, when you get to counter spells that cost 2 mana or less, especially a hard counter, they begin to be a little more worth playing. Leaving 2 mana up isn't a huge cost, and sometimes you'll just have 2 mana available. Frequently enough, you'll counter a creature that costs more than 2 mana, and from that point, you are coming out ahead. All that said, it still isn't a super exciting card or one you should seek out early or even always play. Sometimes people fall into the trap of thinking counter magic is like removal, which I mentioned earlier, and that's not true, as we've already noted. In the end, I think this is a marginal playable, and I see myself putting 1 in some of my blue decks, but I will be able to pick them up without any effort and won't want more than 1 of them ever. So I think that means it comes in at a C-. Next, we have Gale Strike, which is 2 colorless and 1 blue mana for an instant that says return target tapped creature to its owner's hand, draw a card. Only returning tapped creatures is a pretty big limitation because it basically means that this can't be used that well offensively. Still, the ability to interact on the opponent's turn isn't bad, especially against people playing combat tricks. It also is a little bit better in this format than it would otherwise be thanks to the exert mechanic, because that means there will be more tapped creatures around than normal. The fact that it replaces itself is what really pushes this into being a solid card, though. It isn't a card I would take early at all, but I would be happy to have a copy or 2 in most blue decks, and I think that means it is a C+. Next, we have Glyph Keeper, which is 3 colorless mana and 2 blue mana for a 5/3 flyer, and it says, whenever Glyph Keeper becomes a target of a spell or ability for the first time each turn, counter that spell or ability. It also has Embalm for 5 colorless and 2 blue. This is a very powerful card. 5 mana for a 5/3 flyer is already a very good creature. Enough to get into the lower B range all on its own, but this Sphinx does way more than that. It doesn't quite have hexproof, but if your opponent wants to deal with this powerful creature, they are generally going to have to use 2 spells on it, and while you'd of course prefer your Sphinx to stay alive, anytime your opponent has to kill a creature by using 2 cards, you're coming out ahead, especially if both of them were removal spells. And the Sphinx presents enough of a threat that opponents will be interested in doing that sometimes. On top of that, though, the Sphinx has Embalm, a steep cost of 7 mana, but if your opponent had to struggle to kill a Sphinx the first time, once you get to the later part of the game, bringing a zombie version of the Sphinx out of the graveyard is pretty filthy. This card is a straight-up bomb, and for that it deserves an A, and it should be first picked a large number of the time when you see it. Next, we have Floodwaters, which is 4 colorless and 2 blue mana, and it says return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hand, and it's a sorcery, and it has cycling for 2 generic mana. This isn't a card I'm very excited about. Usually I'm pretty happy to bounce 2 creatures, but I'm paying 6 mana for it. I want a little something extra, maybe drawing a card or making a 2/2 token or something. This doesn't do that. It does have cycling, making it a little better than it would otherwise be, since in the early game it can help you dig through your library for a much needed land, and in the late game it can help you find whatever it is you really need. But most of the time what you need won't be Floodwaters. Don't get me wrong, it isn't that this doesn't affect the game at all, it does. But when you're paying 6 mana for this effect, and at sorcery speed, you really want to be bouncing 2 pretty costly creatures to your opponent's hand, so they have to pay more than the 6 mana you just paid to bounce their creatures to replay them. And the board just isn't always going to give you that. Yes, it gets blockers out of the way and slows down your opponents, but for 6 mana, this just doesn't do enough for me to want to play it most of the time. The fact that as cycling manages to get it to the point where there's a card I will play at times when I'm short on playables, or really got there with cycling payoffs, but that still puts it around the D range for me. Next, we have Heckma Sentinels, who are 2 colorless and 1 blue mana for a human cleric, and it says whenever you cycle or discard a card, Heckma Sentinels gets +1/+1 until end of turn. A 3 mana 2/3 is solid-ish on the vanilla test, and the stats boost this gets when you cycle or discard something is no joke. This card is sometimes going to play a lot like a 3 mana 2/3 with prowess, as your opponent won't know whether it's safe to block or not. Blocking with a 3/3 is often going to be dangerous on this card if you have any cards in your hand. You can also pump it defensively, of course. All that said, while the card is a nice inclusion in a deck with a bunch of cycling, it isn't really the card that's going to push your cycling deck over the limit into being a very powerful deck, but its fail case of being a 3 mana 2/3 isn't too bad either, and so it's good in really any blue deck. Great-ish. Well, great's an exaggeration. It's good in any blue deck, but it's better in a cycling deck, but it's never going to be great, basically, because it just isn't an impactful enough card, and because of that, I give it a C. You definitely are happy to play this in any blue deck, but don't take it early. Next, we have Hieroglyphic Illumination, which is 3 colorless mana and 1 blue mana for an instant that says draw 2 cards. It also has cycling for 1 blue mana. Hieroglyphic Illumination is another card with cycling that is basically a split card. One side is a 4 mana instant that draws you 2 cards, the other side is 1 blue to draw a card. Both are pretty solid modes, but nothing super exciting, except that cycling is super supported in this set. I give this a C, meaning I'm fine with it in any blue deck, but won't go after it early and won't be upset that I don't have one. Next, we look at Illusory Wrappings, which is 2 colorless and 1 blue mana for an enchantment aura, enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature has base power and toughness 0/2. Illusory Wrappings is the medium removal spell that blue gets in every set. This is nice-ish because it can make a big scary creature into a 0/2, but the downside is that the creature still has its static and activated abilities and can still block. It even will still have flying if it has that. This is an okay removal spell, and sadly the best one that blue got, but certainly not premium. It's a C+. Generally, if you're playing blue, you want to be leaning on the removal in the other color you're playing, but if you don't get enough of that, Illusory Wrappings is a solid alternative. Next, we have Kefnet the Mindful, who for 2 colorless and 1 blue is a 5/5 flying indestructible legendary creature god, and it says Kefnet the Mindful can't attack or block unless you have 7 or more cards in hand, and then it has an activated ability. 3 and a blue, draw a card, then you may return a land you control to its owner's hand. Like all the gods do, Kefnet has an activated ability aimed at turning him into a creature who can attack or block. Kefnet's ability is a strong one. A repeatable draw a card effect for 3 and a blue is a pretty reasonable card, especially when it comes on an indestructible and flying 5/5 creature. Drawing cards is a great way to get out of a board stall or get further ahead of your opponent, but obviously top decking Kefnet when you are behind is not the greatest. In fact, he's going to be terrible in those situations, as he requires some setup to actually be relevant permanent on the battlefield in terms of combat. That said, Kefnet is going to win a lot of games just by drawing you extra cards and attacking in the air. Its weakness in situations where you're behind, though, keeps it from being a true bomb, and for me, the card only is a B. Still a great card, but one that requires a little bit too much work to be an A. That said, like most Bs, he'll be first pickable in a pack lacking a true bomb or premium removal, and he's definitely worth taking with an early pick. Next, we have Labyrinth Guardian. who is 1 and a blue for a 2/3 illusion warrior, who says, whenever Labyrinth Guardian becomes a target of a spell, sacrifice it. It also has Embalm for 3 and a blue. Labyrinth Guardian does a good job in the vanilla test as a 2-mana 2/3. It has a very real downside, of course. It dies when any spell targets it. This means you can't use your own combat tricks on it, and it turns your opponent's combat tricks into removal spells. It has Embalm, which means it can come back after it inevitably dies, but at a cost of 3 and a blue, it isn't the most efficient of Embalm costs for what it gives you, and what you're getting is pretty fragile, just like the original Guardian was. So this thing is fine, but nothing exciting. Late game value from Embalm is always nice, but this only gets a C+, because it just isn't an intimidating creature. Next, we have Lay Claim. 5 colorless and 2 blue mana for an enchantment aura that says enchant permanent. You control enchanted permanent. It also has cycling for 2 generic mana. So this costs a lot of mana, but it does something worth a lot of mana. It steals a permanent. Anytime there's a card like this, one way to think about it is as a removal spell that says destroy target permanent and put a copy of it into play. That's pretty powerful. Being able to steal a permanent is relevant too over just stealing a creature, because this even means you can steal planeswalkers. Don't count on that happening too often, but it is relevant, and I'm hoping to do it myself. On top of all that, it has cycling, which adds extra flexibility to the card in the early game, especially in decks with cycling synergies. In the end, I think this card is a B-, and we're taking relatively early, but not too early. But the cycling cost on it does make it so it's not just a terrible card in the early game, and that's a nice thing to have. Next, we have Naga Oracle, who for 3 and a blue is a 2/4 Naga cleric, who says, when Naga Oracle enters the battlefield, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put any number of them into your graveyard and the rest back on top of your library in any order. A 4-mana 2/4 is reasonable on the vanilla test, but not great, and this comes with a useful into the battlefield ability. Card selection is always nice, and this gives it to you. It also lets you throw cards in your graveyard, which can have some value, thanks to Embalm and Aftermath, and because there are a few cards, especially in blue-red, that care about cards in your graveyard. Still, this card is basically just sort of an average card that you'll play in blue decks, but not be excited about, and that's, I think, what a C is. Next, we'll look at New Perspectives, which is 5 colorless and 1 blue. It says, when New Perspectives enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards. As long as you have 7 or more cards in hand, you may pay 0 rather than pay cycling costs. New Perspectives is a cool card. It seems like it'll be a lot of fun and constructed. And in Limited, drawing 3 cards for 6 mana isn't too bad. Normally one expects to pay 5 for it, but asking for 6 isn't too crazy. However, you are still playing a card that does nothing to advance the board state. It is the kind of card that is good if you and your opponent are in parity or you are ahead, but if your opponent is way ahead of you, it's too slow and you're probably dead. It comes with an added bonus. Cycling costs are free if you have 7 cards in your hand, and the idea of playing this alongside a bunch of cards with cycling does sound pretty awesome, and I hope that's an achievement I can unlock in this format. But all that said, this card is nothing special. It's just an average playable card for most blue decks that shouldn't be taken early. It is a solid way of drawing cards in the late game, but not much more than that. Though once you have it, cards with cycling do go up in value just a little bit, so keep that in mind. Overall, I give New Perspectives a C. Next, we look at Open into Wonder, which is X and 2 blue mana for a sorcery that says X target creatures can't be blocked this turn. Until end of turn, those creatures gain whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This card's an interesting one, and I think it is the kind of card that will just lead to games ending out of nowhere sometimes, and even when it doesn't end the game, will contribute to the end of the game thanks to the cards you draw. That said, it is something of a win more card, in that your board has to be pretty good for this card to even be worth casting. It's also very clunky, in that you have to tap a lot of mana with it at sorcery speed. Additionally, not all blue decks will be creature heavy enough for this, but I can see blue-green decks especially really liking a card like this. I think this card in the end is about a C. You shouldn't take it early at all. There's really probably only one deck that wants it, but in that deck it's going to be solid. Next, we have Pull from Tomorrow, which is X and 2 blue, for an instant that says, draw X cards, then discard a card. Pull from Tomorrow is a pretty great card draw spell for the late game. Being instant speed means you can wait to cast it on your opponent's turn, and that's a pretty big deal. And if you manage to draw 5 or more cards off of this in the late game, you probably just won. All that said, this is the kind of card that you don't really want to have in your opening hand because you won't be casting it for a while. It doesn't really become a good deal until you spend about 6 mana on it. Before that, it's pretty inefficient. If you are more than just a little bit behind an opponent too, tapping out to draw a bunch of cards isn't going to help you out immediately. It is worth noting, though, that the discard a card aspect on the card will actually sometimes be relevant. All of the cards that have a cycling payoff also have a discard payoff, so sometimes you'll get a useful trigger out of discarding a card from this. While this card is sweet in a control deck, it isn't the kind of card you should take early, and it isn't even really a high pick. I would take this in the middle of a pack and be pretty happy about it, though. All in all, though, I give this card a C. Next, we have River Serpent, which is 5 colorless and 1 blue mana for a 5/5, and it says River Serpent can't attack unless there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard. It also has a single blue mana as a cycling cost. Here's one of those cards that cares about cards in your graveyard, which seems to be a minor sub-theme within the set, but this is a pretty bad one on the face of it. 6 mana for a 5/5 already isn't very good, and this comes with a downside, which I think starts this card out in the F range. Adding a really low-costed cycling is nice and pushes this into being a card I will play as my 23rd card thanks to cycling, or play in a deck really heavy with the cycling mechanic, but in the end it gets a D from me, and it takes corner cases or a draft gone wrong for this to find its way into your deck. Next, we have Sacred Excavation, which is 3 colorless and 1 blue, and it says return up to 2 target cards with cycling from your graveyard to your hand. This is a cool card, and makes cards that have cycling that you never plan on cycling, like Cast Out, a little scarier because you can get them back. Your deck does need a critical mass of cards with cycling for this to be playable, though, and that's probably something like 10 or more. That's not too hard to do in this format, but I would advise against playing this card unless you get there, as you will find yourself with it awkwardly stuck in your hand and only able to get back 1 card for 4 mana, which is completely terrible. Even getting back 2 cards is admittedly not great, depending on the cards, and not every blue deck will want this. I think this comes in as a D+ most of the time, though if you really get there on cycling, it probably pushes into the C range. Next, we have Scribe of the Mindful. 2 colorless and 1 blue for a 2/2 human cleric, who has an activated ability that says pay 1 colorless and tap Scribe of the Mindful and sacrifice it. Return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. 3 mana for 2/2 is obviously a failure on the vanilla test, but the Scribe has a useful activated ability. It can return instants and sorceries from your graveyard by sacrificing itself. Returning cards of these 2 types is often very relevant and powerful, as most of your removal will be in those card types. Chump blocking with this and getting back your Magma Spray or other good removal spell seems pretty solid. Basically, any blue deck would be happy with 1 copy of this Scribe, and a deck that is super heavy with instant and sorcery removal would take even more copies. That said, it has the potential in the early game of just being a 3 mana 2/2 when your graveyard is empty, and when you have to cast her to just trade with something, her value drops significantly. Because she won't always be doing the optimal thing, just like most cards won't be, she comes out to a C in the end. As I said, most blue decks will be happy to play her and happy to run 1 copy, but getting her won't be that difficult, and she shouldn't be taken that early. Next, we have Seeker of Insight, who is 1 colorless and 1 blue for a human wizard, and it has an activated ability of tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Activate this ability only if you've cast a non-creature spell this turn. 2 mana 1/3s are usually okay cards, especially when they come with upside, and this comes with some serious upside. It can turn into a merfolk looter if you cast a non-creature spell during your turn anyway. This card has synergies with a couple of different archetypes too. The blue-black cycling deck, which also pays you off for discarding things, and the blue-red spells deck, where you will probably be able to abuse the looting effect the most. It is a solid card in any deck, mind you, but in those two it will find the most synergy and be able to use its ability to the greatest effect. I think this card is a C in your average blue deck, probably a C+ in one of those 2 decks. Don't take it early, but by mid-pack, it probably isn't a bad idea. Looting is way more powerful than it looks, and in this set, it's got extra synergy. So this card I may even be underrating a little bit as I'm talking about it. Maybe it deserves a B-. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let's move on to the next card, which is Shimmer Scale Drake. For 4 colorless and a blue, you get a 3/4 with flying and cycling cost of 2. 5 mana for a 3/4 flyer on its own is probably a D+ or a C-. Adding cycling to this Drake pushes it further into the C range, though, as it gives you the obvious added flexibility to turn it into another card when you need to. It also helps that it is in a color that really likes to cycle things, too. All of that pushes the Drake into being a solid C, and a card you're happy to take mid-pack. Next, we have Slither Blade. For 1 blue mana, you get a Naga Rogue, who is a 1/2, and it says Slither Blade can't be blocked. Most 1 mana 1/2s quickly become irrelevant, but this one brings unblockable with it, so it can keep attacking the whole game. Not for very much, mind you, but hey, at least it can attack. Still, this card's terrible. Like the majority of 1-drops out there, it just doesn't do enough in a game of limited to warrant being put in your deck in the place of more impactful cards. Good luck winning the game with your Slither Blade over 20 turns. I'm going to give this card a straight F, and I think it's one of my candidates for cards people will overrate just because it looks like it does well on the vanilla test. And it does, technically, but 1-drops and vanilla tests isn't a good way to go because 1-drops quickly become irrelevant, even one that's unblockable. Next, we look at Ta-Krop Skirmisher, who for 1 and a blue is a 2/1 Naga Warrior, and it doesn't have anything else except for Embalm for 3 colorless and a blue. 2 mana 2/1 with upside is fine. The upside here is all Embalm, and while the Embalm cost is a bit high, it is a nice mana sink to have in the late game, like all Embalm costs. Still, the creature isn't anything special, even if you get 2 copies of it over the course of the game, and while it is a 2-drop, a solid 2-drop, and I would play it in any blue deck, I wouldn't go out of my way to draft him, and because of that, I give it a C. Next, we move to Trial of Knowledge, which is 3 colorless and 1 blue mana for an enchantment, and it says, when Trial of Knowledge enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards, then discard a card. Then it has, as all the trials do, a clause about cartouches. It says, when a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, return Trial of Knowledge to its owner's hand. 4 mana to draw 3 cards and discard a card is already a card that I'm happy with in most blue decks. This card brings some extra synergy, though. Let's talk about the discard a card aspect of the card first. There are several cards which trigger when you discard cards, and there are plenty of cards in the format that can do things out of the graveyard. Additionally, as a trial, this bounces anytime you play a cartouche. This means that you can cast it again and draw even more cards. If you get to cast Trial of Knowledge twice in a game and you aren't under a ton of pressure, it is going to be pretty difficult to lose. Every blue deck wants this card, and it is even worth taking as early as pick 4 or 5, but it is worth noting it's not so good if you're behind in the game, but if you're in any other stage of the game, it's pretty good. And it costs low enough mana that even if you're behind, you'll probably survive long enough to reap the benefits of drawing all those cards. In the end, this trial gets a B- from me because of the efficient card draw and the various synergies that the trial gives you in this set. It is pretty darn powerful. Next, we have Vizier of Many Faces, who is 2 colorless and 2 blue for a 0/0 shapeshifter cleric. And it says, you may have Vizier of Many Faces enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except if Vizier of Many Faces was embalmed. That token has no mana cost, it's white, and it's a zombie in addition to its other types. And has an embalm, as you would guess, for 3 colorless and 2 blue. Clone is usually a pretty reasonable card in Limited. Copying your best creature or your opponent's best creature is usually a pretty good deal, and this clone comes with embalm, so you get to do it again. These cards do, of course, suffer if your deck doesn't have any decent-sized creatures, and you go up against an opponent with something similar, as copying your opponent's 3/3 with a medium exert ability isn't going to feel great with this thing, but most of the time you'll be able to copy a pretty nice creature with the Vizier, and for that, plus the value of Embalm, it gets into the B range for me, where it is a card I want in basically every blue deck that I'm willing to take pretty early. Next, we have another Vizier, the Vizier of Tumbling Sands, who is 2 colorless and a blue for a 1/3 human cleric, and it has an activated ability, tap, untap another target permanent. Also has cycling for 1 and a blue, and it says when you cycle Vizier of Tumbling Sands, untap target permanent. Vizier of Tumbling Sands is part of a cycle of cards in this set that do things when they are cycled, which effectively makes them into split cards of sorts. As we just saw, the Vizier can untap a permanent when you cycle it. The most commonly used application of this half of the card will be to untap a creature who can then ambush, block an opponent's creature, and then either trade with it or just kill it. The other half of the card is pretty good too. 3 mana for a 1/3 isn't so good, but being able to untap permanents is way better than it sounds. First, permanent includes land, so the Vizier can help ramp you into your 6-drops more quickly and allow you access to more mana. Second, it works really well with Exert. Your Exert creatures might not untap during your untap step, but Vizier of Tumbling Sands doesn't care and will untap the creature anyway, allowing you to use Exert every single turn, which can be pretty filthy. Finally, you can also just use the card the same way you would have if you had cycled it. To untap a creature you control to block, but it won't be much of an ambush here since your opponent will see you have the Vizier in play. Any blue deck wants to play a copy of this card thanks to all the different things it can do, and while it isn't crazy powerful or anything, the wide array of things a Vizier can do make it a very good playable, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Winds of Rebuke, which is 1 colorless and 1 blue for an instant, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Each player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Bouncing a non-land permanent for 2 shows up in a lot of limited formats, and as always, it's a nice card to have. Gives you a tempo swing, usually a big one because you can bounce anything with it, including 6-drops and things, and sometimes it can even claim a card in the case of a creature having an aura or a combat trick used on it. This one comes with an extra line of text that will sometimes have upside, but will sometimes be downside depending on what gets milled. If you had a creature with Embalm or a spell with Aftermath, you're going to feel pretty good, but if your opponent does that, you'll feel the opposite. It's worth noting too that the blue-red deck especially seems to like throwing some cards in the graveyard, so it has some extra utility there. All in all, this is a card that I'm happy to have and take relatively early, maybe around pick 6 or 7 in most blue decks, and I think that gives it at least a C+. Next, we have Zenith Seeker, who for 3 colorless and 1 blue mana is a 2/2 with flying, and it says whenever you cycle or discard a card, target creature gains flying until end of turn. Zenith Seeker is one of the better payoffs for playing a bunch of cards with cycling. Giving creatures the best evasive ability, flying, is a pretty big deal. As we've seen so far in this review, there are a lot of cards in this color that have cycling, so getting Zenith Seeker going shouldn't be too difficult. Plus, the fail case of the card is that it is a 4 mana 2/2 flyer, which isn't great, but not the worst place to be either. Because cycling is so ubiquitous in this set, and you're going to end up with 3 to 5 cards with cycling without even trying, I think Zenith Seeker is worth taking pretty early, and I'm willing to give it a B-. Well, that does it for today's limited review video. Zenith Seeker's the final blue card in Amonkhet. Tomorrow, I'll be back with a limited set review for black. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, don't forget to click the like button. Let me know in the comments where you think I'm wrong, and don't forget to subscribe to make sure you catch the rest of my limited review. Additionally, my content is supported in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for Magic the Gathering content. One of the things that 5Color Combo is best known for is their sweet original playmats and tokens. Right now, they are running a Kickstarter campaign that helps fund new tokens, and you can actually receive tokens for your donation, including these really cool 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse zombie tokens that you see here. You can find more information about the Kickstarter in the description below. It ends very, very soon, so act quickly.